Human trafficking. It's a pretty common plot element in Disney's animated movies. Sometimes it's the central focus of the story, other times it's more incidental, but it appears in these films with surprising frequency. Not every Disney movie has trafficking in it, of course. No trafficking in Bambi, for example. And not every case is clear. I'll also discuss some examples where we don't have enough detail to evaluate, or where the situation is ambiguous for some reason. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to use the United States federal definition of human trafficking. Here's the law, but the core of it is inducing a person to engage in labor, service, or commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. We'll get into the specifics of force, fraud, and coercion in the film examples. So for now, the key is that you need to know these two elements: a purpose, like labor, and an action that compels someone to engage in that purpose, like threatening to hurt their family if they don't. Under U.S. law, minors engaged in commercial sex are always trafficking victims, regardless of force, fraud, and coercion. But these are kids' movies, so we won't actually spend a lot of time on sex trafficking. This video is all about forced labor. Also, since these are Disney movies, we need some definition of what is human. I'm going to consider sentient animals and supernatural beings like fairies and gods or whatever to be human in the context of these stories. Finally, yes, this is a historical. I'd argue that slavery and forced labor have always been wrong, but we're going to apply a relatively recent legal framework to some pretty old stories. Alright, first up, Snow White. This film includes human trafficking as a relatively small part of the plot setup. Snow White performs domestic labor for her stepmother, so we have a clear labor component. She may be doing this work out of a sense of filial duty, but from the clothes she wears to the way the evil queen treats her, including deciding to kill her, it's clear that this is not a typical family relationship, and Snow White has a limited choice. Under certain legal frameworks, abusing a position of power, which the evil queen clearly does, is one form of coercion, but that's not really the case in the US. Regardless, the written prologue explicitly states that she was forced by the queen to be a servant in the palace. Also, in passing, the queen calls the supernatural being she summons in the mirror a slave.
Slave in the magic mirror, come from the farthest space.
But it's unclear what their relationship is really like. On to Pinocchio. Pinocchio is such a strange film, and I'm just going to focus on one plot point: Pleasure Island. The coachman lures young boys to his island, employing henchmen to recruit the children through false pretenses and posing as authority figures.
Quick, Doctor, that report. Oh, this makes it perfectly clear. My boy, you are allergic.
Allergic?
Yes, and there is only one cure. A vacation on Pleasure Island.
Pleasure Island?
So we do have some fraud to start. Once on the island, they are transformed into donkeys. Obviously, that's not a control tactic that we see in the real world, but we do see traffickers brand, tattoo, and otherwise mark their victims as a way to assert control and ownership. In the case of Pinocchio, it primarily serves as a way to keep them from asking for help or reporting on what is happening. We even see the boys that can still talk after turning into donkeys are kept on the island.
Take him back. He can still talk.
Please, I don't want to be a donkey. Let me out of here.
Quiet!
The children, having been turned into donkeys, are then shipped off to labor in the salt mines, the circus, or other destinations, presumably. We thus clearly have the labor element established, as well as force, fraud, and coercion. This is also a good time to talk about a myth about human trafficking. These children are transported for labor, but transportation is not necessary for something to be human trafficking. In Snow White was trafficked in her own home, for example. Which brings us to Cinderella, a film that has a fairly similar setup to Snow White, but the whole stepdaughter forced into domestic labor thing is a larger part of the plot across the whole story. The narrator sums it up pretty succinctly.
Cinderella was abused, humiliated, and finally forced to become a servant in her own house.
So we have the domestic work and force, fraud, and coercion well established for this story. We'll come back to this later, but it's worth noting that domestic work falls into the category of labor trafficking, where the trafficker is saving money by not paying someone, even if there's no specific profit. This is in contrast, say, to forcing someone to work on your farm or in your factory so that you can keep all the profit from their labor. All right, Sleeping Beauty. This film is a little more borderline, but I want to highlight two plot elements that are worth considering from a trafficking framework. First, we have Maleficent's minions. We don't really have enough information to know if they're compelled to be her minions. We see that she's abusive to them, and we can easily imagine that that might create a dynamic where they're scared for their safety if they try to leave. This probably applies to henchmen in most of the Disney movies, and it starts to touch on some complexities of forcing someone to engage in illegal activity. Sometimes they'll have a specific profit motive, you force someone to steal money so that you can then take the money. Other times like this, there is no profit motive, but there's still labor they'd otherwise have to pay for. Regardless, I'm not going to look at these examples in other Disney films. It's so common, and we typically don't have enough detail to really assess whether what's going on is trafficking or not. Also, let's talk about forced marriage.
Thus today would they announce that Philip, Hubert's son and heir, to Stephen's child would be betrothed.
Now, forced marriage is not considered human trafficking under U.S. law. It is in some other countries. And it's important to distinguish between arranged marriage and forced marriage. I think that Aurora and Philip are probably just in an arranged marriage, given that Philip decides to marry someone else, and King Hubert, though not happy about it, seems to accept that decision.
I didn't say it was Aurora.
You most certainly did. You said that.
I said I met the girl I was going to marry.
And with that, it's now on to what may be the best example of labor trafficking in the entire animated Disney canon, The Rescuers. This is the first film we've talked about, aside from Pinocchio, where we have any insight into the recruitment, and where the victim is not a family member. We don't see the first interactions between Medusa, Snoops, and Penny, but they are described throughout the film.
Well, it was your brilliant idea to use little girl for this caper. If you left it to me, I'd...
Snoops, you're not thinking.
I know. She's the only one small enough to squeeze down the black hole.
Penny is an orphan living in an institution, so she's particularly vulnerable to trafficking. It's implied in the film that Medusa specifically targeted Penny because of her vulnerability. Runaway, homeless youth, youth in foster care, and youth in group homes are disproportionately affected by trafficking, both for commercial sex and forced labor. We also have a pretty clear labor component. Medusa is forcing Penny to functionally mine for a diamond. Medusa doesn't want to sell the diamond, but she needs Penny to do this work for two reasons. First, she needs someone small enough to enter the cave. And second, she has no legal claim to the diamond, so she can't really hire someone, and she needs someone she can control. Mining can, of course, be legal, but in this case it's illegal. That doesn't negate that Penny is being compelled to perform labor for Medusa, but it's worth calling out explicitly that the work does not have to be legal for it to be considered human trafficking. This is somewhat controversial since a lot of illegal activities has some elements of coercion, of course, like most gang activity, for example. This film shows a range of tactics used to compel Penny to do this work. First, Penny is quickly taken from her support systems and isolated. She attempts to run away and is chased and forced to return. Medusa uses her two crocodiles as guards or enforcers, and there's clearly a strong threat of violence since these are large predators that could easily harm Penny. Medusa also uses emotional manipulation to try to gain Penny's compliance.
You must gain their confidence. Make them like you.
Later, in the scene where Medusa makes Penny go into the cave, she becomes more overtly coercive. She takes Penny's teddy bear, which has been established throughout the film as deeply important to the little girl, and threatens that she'll keep or destroy it if the girl does not obey.
You get down there and find the big diamond, or you will never see that teddy again.
Again, this is a common abuse tactic. Medusa's behavior while Penny is searching for the diamond also makes it clear that she is willing to follow through on her threats, and she doesn't care about Penny's well-being. Moving on, The Great Mouse Detective. In this film, the evil villain, Ratigan, kidnaps a mouse and forces him to build a robot to impersonate the Queen of England.
And my new royal consort, Professor Ratigan.
really stellar plan there. This mouse is actually a pretty minor character in the story, which is focused on the mouse equivalents of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. That said, it's a clear case of trafficking again. We have the labor element building the robot. He's a toy maker, so this is his general job, actually, which is a bit of a change from our previous examples. And clear elements of force. Ratigan makes overt threats, demonstrates his willingness to be violent with his henchmen, and attempts to kidnap the toy maker's daughter to use as further leverage to compel the labor. Beauty and the Beast. Belle is not a trafficking victim in Beauty and the Beast. There's no element of labor or services. She is held against her will, so she's a kidnapping victim. Yes, I realize she initially volunteers for this, but just because you volunteer for something initially doesn't mean it can't turn into abuse later. And also, you can't really volunteer to be held prisoner. Now, the various household servants are a more interesting question. Are they free to leave? I have no idea. It's not clear in the film. I mean, they can't exactly leave now that they're in the form of furniture and household goods, but that's not the Beast's doing, that's the Enchantress's doing. We would need more information to assess this one. Aladdin. This is an interesting case in a few ways. So the genie is explicitly described as a slave.
You will do what I order you to do, slave.
He wears shackles, and here's how he describes what he would wish for if he could.
But oh, to be free. Not to have to go, what do you need? What do you need? What do you need? To be my own master. Such a thing would be greater than all the magic and all the treasures in all the world.
And it's clear during the portion where Jafar has the lamp that Genie is compelled to do whatever his masters tell him, even if he doesn't want to. But compelled by whom? It's not really the masters per se. They are taking advantage of this cosmic setup, but the degree to which they compel the labor is an interesting question. You could argue, though, that they are culpable. They're taking advantage of a vulnerability to extract labor they know that the genie can't decline. We also get some potentially forced marriage. I think the case of forced is stronger in Aladdin than in Sleeping Beauty, since Jasmine makes it very clear that she objects, but the law requires her to comply.
The law says you must be married to a prince by your next birthday.
The law is wrong.
Moreover, once Jafar is in control, he uses that power to make Jasmine subservient to him. He attempts to use it to compel her to fall in love with him. Hunchback of Notre Dame and Tangled. Okay, getting a little off of chronology, but these two need to get lumped together because they're very similar. Abusive parental figure holds a person in an elevated structure, keeps them isolated through portraying the world as dangerous and scary.
Oh, my dear Quasimodo, you don't know what it's like out there. I do.
Ruffians, thugs, poison ivy, quicksand.
And the person engages in something that can be described as labor. The labor element is clearer in Hunchback. Ringing those bells is physically demanding and would normally be a paid position, I assume. But it's also something he loves doing, and it's unclear if Furlow cares whether he rings them or not. Well, we can debate if magic hair healing is labor. If it is, there is clearly fraud and coercion used to induce it by Mother Gothel. Hercules. So I guess it makes sense for the most part that Disney villains force people to engage in illegal activity or domestic work, since they're usually not running a business or trying to turn a profit, just scheming for power. Meg is essentially an indentured servant to Hades. She traded her soul to save her ex's life, and to pay off this debt, she has to provide years of service to Hades. Manipulating debts is a common tactic that traffickers use.
You give me the key to bringing down Wonder Breath, and I give you the thing that you crave most in the entire cosmos. Your freedom.
Now you might say, well wait, I work because I have to pay off debts. Am I a trafficking victim? Well, most likely not. The key question is whether you have a choice in how you repay your debt. Can you do it by working at a movie theater or a restaurant or a store, or do you have to work at the factory owned by the person to whom you owe the debt? Also, when we see debt bondage used by traffickers, we tend to see tactics like arbitrarily increasing the debt, often as punishment.
Fine. So instead of subtracting 2 years from your sentence, hey, I'm going to add 2 on, okay? Give that your best shot.
Having the debt be for a ludicrous amount. your soul, for example, and other tactics that show the debt is a sham and primarily a tool used for keeping the victim feeling like they can't leave.
Aren't we forgetting one teensy-weensy but ever so crucial little tiny detail? I own you!
Mulan. Mulan starts with an arranged marriage plot that is quickly abandoned. We don't have any indication of force beyond the pressure Mulan clearly feels based on her duty to her family and social gender roles, but again, the movie moves on so quickly from this point that it's hard to evaluate. Instead, let's talk about forced military service.
By order of the Emperor, one man from every family must serve in the Imperial Army.
Now, most societies throughout history have had some form of military conscription at some point, and military service that is compelled by the state is generally not considered labor trafficking. It would be for private groups, even if they act like militaries, like mercenary forces or terrorist cells, but not actual governments. The International Labor Organization does recognize certain forms of state-sponsored forced labor, but compulsory military service is explicitly excluded from the definition, and thus allowed under this framework, so long as it's purely military service and not, say, using drafted soldiers to dig a mine or build roads or something like that. Also, use of child soldiers, whether voluntary or conscripted, is on the ILO's list of worst forms of child labor. It is considered a war crime and a human rights violation, so this is a long way to say that while there is conscripted military service in Mulan, under this international framework, so long as everyone is 18, it would not be considered forced labor. So there you have it. I know I didn't touch on every film that has some element of trafficking or forced labor in it. There's more in films like Dumbo, Oliver and Company, and in general it can be surprising where you find forced labor in children's media if you think about it. If you have a favorite example of human rights abuses in the Disney animated canon that I didn't mention, leave a comment.